Thank you for being here. Last year, we all watched as the Standing Rock Sioux mounted a massive resistance against the Dakota Access Pipeline, which was being constructed through their territories without them having given their free, prior, and informed consent. Unfortunately, this is the case for many Indigenous communities worldwide, cases that are happening today and what are continuing to happen as we speak. What's interesting about all these cases is that free, prior, and informed consent continues to be the site of the failure of the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the financial sector. My project aims to ask why. Why is it that it's continuously at the site of ostensible goodwill that free, prior, and informed consent always fails to be successfully implemented? As an overview, free, prior, and informed consent is an Indigenous right that's embedded within the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And it simply means that Indigenous peoples have the right to provide their consent when a project or activity is going to affect their territories or any of their other rights. And they have the ability to provide it in a manner that is free from coercion, prior to the beginning or authorization of any project on their territories, and in a manner that is properly informed of all project impacts and components, and in a timely and accessible way. I started my research by looking at 4 groups of stakeholders which play a major role in this process: international financial institutions, Indigenous organizations, private sector bodies looking at Indigenous rights, and Indigenous organizations working on private companies. The way I conducted my analysis was using a literary methodology called close reading, where I actually deconstructed the texts of each of these actors, 8 influential guidelines that these groups of actors had put out. I did this by looking for what they understood the nature of free, prior, informed consent to be, asking, what is free, prior, informed consent? The objective. What do they understand free, prior, informed consent's objective to be? What is it actually meant to do? And third, its function. How does free, prior, and informed consent actually work in order to achieve its goal? As an example of my analysis, I took quotes, significant quotes from each of these texts and deconstructed them to fit each of these 3 components. So this quote is taken from the Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact's training manual on how to implement free, prior, informed consent. As an example, FPIC as a mechanism can be seen as the nature. What is FPIC? Whereby Indigenous peoples and Indigenous communities are able to conduct is the fashion through which free, prior, informed consent is seen to function. And independent collective decision-making on matters affecting them is the objective that the Asian Indigenous Peoples Pact has identified free, prior, informed consent as fulfilling. Now, my research was based on the hypothesis that the problems that are being encountered on the practical level of operationalizing free, prior, informed consent are actually symptomatic of greater discords on the conceptual level. By going through this research and going through 8 of these influential guidelines, my findings showed that there was quite a conceptual disarray when it came to understanding what free, prior, informed consent actually is. One of the biggest takeaways was that the financial sector and Indigenous communities greatly differed as to what they understood the objectives to be. The financial sector was focused on the micro objectives, i.e. the actual relationship between the company and the Indigenous community they are in consultation with. Indigenous peoples, on the other hand, saw free, prior, informed consent as a method to open up into the other realm of Indigenous rights, to be able to claim the right to self-determination, the right to culture, the right to property, etc. The one piece of consensus that was there was that FPIC enables meaningful participation. That's the way a lot of the actors saw FPIC as actually functioning. However, what was most concerning is that there was not a single piece of consensus as to what FPIC actually is. What is its nature? People called it a mechanism, a practice, a process, a function, a right, a concept, a principle. The significance of these findings are that this is one of the first studies that has been done trying to understand the conceptual level of free, prior, informed consent, not the theoretical underpinning in law, and not its actual practical operationalization. The findings of my study show that Indigenous actors need to have a consensus as to what free, prior, informed consent is actually aiming to do before the private sector can effectively implemented in line with the Rights Decolonizing Directive. Another significant factor is that the language surrounding free prior informed consent is imprecise and unstable. As shown through my analysis, everyone was using different words and different understandings of the same word in order to mean very different things. What we need to take a step back and understand is that free prior informed consent is an indigenous conception of property rights and worldview that has been translated into a form that is legible to the dominant paradigm, i.e. the law. What we need to ask ourselves is what was lost in the process of translating this concept of indigenous property and indigenous worldview into a form that the private sector would be able to use. Thank you.